Do you remember your first year at the Colorado Dragon Boat Festival?
Hello. Thank you all for coming today. My name is Sarah Moore, and I'm the Executive Director of Colorado Dragon Boat, the 501c3 nonprofit that brings you this amazing film festival. Thank you so much for coming today for this really important community conversation. I'm just going to do a brief overview, and then we will go ahead and get started because we're in the theater until about 10:50, 10:55. And after the conclusion of the reenactment, we invite everybody out into the lobby for further discussion, and I think you guys will have a lot of questions or topics of conversation that we would like to elaborate on. But thank you so much for being here for the Heart Mountain reenactment. In 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing Japanese incarceration camps during World War II. One act of heroism and courage was exemplified by the some 315 Japanese American men that stood up to the draft in an act of civil disobedience, refusing to fight for the U.S. when their own constitutional rights and civil liberties were being denied. This reenactment hits home, I think, for a lot of us here in the audience, and me as well. My grandfather was incarcerated in Tule Lake during World War II time, and I think it just by a raise of hands, how many people here have a direct or indirect relationship to someone who was incarcerated? Yes. This is a very, very powerful reenactment, and I have to thank Janet Shee Hayek, our board member, and Andrew Ho with APABA, and all of our actors here who are really, it's very, very powerful what you're about to see, and just thank you all for putting all of your dedication into this. Without further ado, we will start. Thank you.
It is March 20th, 1944. Takeo Ishikawa is sitting alone at a desk at the Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. He has finished writing a letter to his local draft board in Palo Alto, California.
Dear Sir, on March 5th, 1944, I received my pre-induction physical notice stating that I was to report on the morning of March 8th to Powell, Wyoming. I did not report, not because I'm trying to evade the draft, but because of my firm conviction that what the government is doing is wrong and that our status should be fully clarified prior to our induction into the armed forces. I was born in Mountain View, California. I attended public school, where we were taught to believe in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and that these instruments would apply to the minority groups. This was the land of the free, a democracy, and the laws governing this nation would apply to any individual, regardless of race, color, or creed. And then on December 7th, 1941, the so-called sneak attack on Pearl Harbor was perpetrated. We lowly individuals of Japanese descent were as unaware of any such plot to attack as were our American neighbors. Outraged by the deed, many of us, to show our sincerity and loyalty, bought war bonds, joined Red Cross units, donated sums of money, and so forth. Many of the Nisei boys volunteered for the armed services, but were rejected on account of our racial background. For us, life changed overnight and became a nightmare. Fear obsessed us. Our bank accounts and assets were frozen. A curfew was placed on us. Our fathers were incarcerated, rudely snatched away from their families. Finally came our evacuation proclamation from the president and the utterance from General DeWitt that
A jab is a jab.
We were not accused of any crime nor charged with any seditious acts or sabotage. Without any trial, we were ordered to leave our homes. We were uprooted from everything we held dear and near to us, our homes, friends, and fortune. On May 6, 1942, my aged mother, my sister, and I left Mountain View for the famed Santa Anita horse tracks. We were number 32013. That was our number and still is. We were no longer individuals in an upright society, but merely numbers, the same as any convict. After 3 long months, we were transferred here to Hart Mountain. In our present status, we are not free citizens. As a limited rights citizen, I protest my drafting into the Selective Service. I want to be a free citizen, enjoying all the rights and privileges of an American citizen before I enter the military service. I sincerely hope for a better clarification, and until such time, I do not intend to report, but if necessary, I will contest in the courts the legality and constitutionality of the Selective Service as it pertains to the Nisei. Sincerely yours, Takeo Ishikawa.
Only a matter of months later, on the morning of May 15, 1944, Takeo Ishikawa stood before a federal judge and with 62 other Japanese American prisoners from the Hart Mountain concentration camp, pleaded not guilty to violations of the Selective Service Act of 1940 for failure to report for pre-induction physical examination. Our presentation today will tell the story of Mr. Ishikawa and other draft resistors from Hart Mountain, based on the records of the court proceedings and other contemporaneous documents.
The Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In the next 3 days, the FBI arrested nearly 1,300 Issei, first-generation Japanese immigrants in Hawaii and the western states. These were the fathers described as snatched away in Ishikawa's letter. Under the law at the time, they could not be naturalized as U.S. citizens because of their race. The children of the Issei, the Nisei, had been born in this country. By virtue of the 14th Amendment, they were U.S. citizens. While shocked by the arrest of their parents, the Nisei believed that they would be treated differently.
They were mistaken. On February 19, 1942, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, authorizing military authorities to designate military areas from which any and all persons might be excluded. Shortly thereafter, General John DeWitt, Commanding General of the Western Defense Command, issued Public Proclamation Number 4, forbidding any person of Japanese ancestry in parts of California, Oregon, Washington, and Arizona to leave their areas without military permission. In his report recommending removal of all Japanese Americans from these areas, he stated his views mirroring those of politicians and newspapers at the time. Here are General DeWitt, a politician, and a newspaper columnist.
The Japanese race is an enemy race. All members of that race are potential enemies. Even if Americanized, their undiluted racial strain makes their removal from the vital Pacific coast absolutely necessary. The fact that no sabotage has yet taken place only makes it more likely that such action will be taken.
I join the elected representatives from the other Western states when I demand that all Japanese, whether citizens or not, be placed in inland concentration camps. Why, if an American-born Japanese is really patriotic, this is his opportunity. He can permit himself to be placed in a concentration camp.
Just to be clear for all my readers, we should just move them to the Badlands. I hate the Japanese, and that goes for all of them.
By the end of March 1942, Japanese American families were being told to prepare for removal from the designated areas and that they could bring with them only what they could carry. When they reported as ordered, they were given numbers and moved to so-called assembly centers, which included horse stables at racetracks. Some 120,000 people, nearly 2/3 of them U.S. citizens, spent the summer of 1942 in these centers, located mostly in California, as the federal government prepared 10 concentration camps in more remote areas in other states.
The Japanese American families in the assembly centers were herded onto trains and shipped to the camps in the late summer and early fall of 1942. They went quietly, with many apparently adopting the attitude of the Japanese American Citizens League, the JACL, an organization created by the Nisei in 1929 to advance the interests of Americans of Japanese descent. The JACL president, Saburo Kido, stated the group's position as follows.
We are going into exile as our duty to our country because the president and the military commanders of the area have deemed it necessary. What greater love, what greater testimony of one's loyalty could anyone ask than this? Leave your homes, your businesses, and your friends in order that your country may better fight a war.
6 months later, the JACL convened a conference to discuss cooperation with the War Relocation Authority. Delegates were selected by the JACL and granted furloughs from their camps. Mike Masoka asked them to endorse the JACL's latest effort to prove Japanese American loyalty.
It was a proud time for us when in this nation's first peacetime draft in 1940 called upon us to serve. 3,500 Nisei were drafted in the first year. It was humiliating when, in the wake of Pearl Harbor, we were reclassified as aliens, ineligible for the draft. We are being deprived of our biggest chance to prove our loyalty. Somewhere on the field of battle, in a baptism of blood, we and our comrades must prove to all who question that we are ready and willing to die for the one country we know and pledge our allegiance to.
The delegates passed a resolution asking the federal government to reclassify the Nisei as draft eligible. The Office of War Information suggested instead a volunteer Nisei combat team based on an individualized test of loyalty. Shortly thereafter, President Roosevelt announced his approval of the new all-Nisei unit, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. Mike Masaoka was disappointed, but he volunteered to become the first member of the unit.
Finally, in December 1943, the War Department determined to reinstate the draft for the Nisei into segregated combat units. On January 20th, 1944, the War Department announced that the Nisei would be reclassified by their selective service boards and called for induction if physically qualified.
The populations of the different camps reacted in different ways to this news. At the Heart Mountain Camp, located 60 miles east of Yellowstone National Park in northwest Wyoming, 55-year-old Kiyoshi Okamoto started writing about the injustices of detention. This led to the creation of the Fair Play Committee, a collective effort by detainees at Heart Mountain to openly resist the draft. The FPC carefully limited its membership to Japanese American citizens who professed loyalty to the United States and were willing to serve in the military once their civil rights were restored.
As the FPC gained momentum and support, its voice became louder and more direct. One of the newspapers that supported the FPC was the Rocky Shimpo, a newspaper based out of Denver, Colorado, that served the Japanese American community and was widely read at Heart Mountain. Jimmy Amora, the Shimpo's English language editor, printed news that reported favorably on the FPC's activities and editorials that questioned the lawfulness and propriety of the draft. In March 1944, the FPC leaders distributed materials that conveyed their views.
We, the members of the FPC, are not afraid to go to war. We are not afraid to risk our lives for our country. We would gladly sacrifice our lives to protect and uphold the principles of our country. But without any hearings, without due process of law, without any charges filed against us, without any evidence of wrongdoing on our part, 110,000 innocent people were kicked out of their homes, literally uprooted from where they lived for the greater part of their life, and herded like dangerous criminals into concentration camps with barbed wire fences and military police guarding it. And then, without rectification of the injustices committed against us, and without restoration of our rights as guaranteed by the Constitution, we are ordered to join the Army through discriminatory procedures into a segregated combat unit. We, the members of the Fair Play Committee, hereby refuse to go to the physical examination or to the induction if or when we're called in order to contest the issue.
Within days, 5 Nisei refused to get on the bus for their pre-induction physicals, and 2 days later, 7 more. They were arrested and jailed. More refused to report, and by the end of March 1944, 41 were in Wyoming County jails, and Jimmy Amura, the Denver newspaperman, was forced to resign. His newspaper was told that it'd be closed unless Amura was removed as English language editor.
2 indictments were filed with respect to the Heart Mountain draft resistors, resulting in 2 trials. The first was United States versus Fuji, which would become known as the mass trial, as 63 draft resistors from Heart Mountain would be tried together on the charge of evading the draft. The second was United States versus Okamoto, which would become known as the conspiracy trial, as 7 of the FPC leaders at Heart Mountain would be tried together for conspiracy to counsel, aid, and abet the Heart Mountain draft resistors. The government charged an 8th defendant with conspiracy, Jimmy Amura. He had never met any of the resistors, but was indicted solely on the basis of his newspaper columns.
The mass trial commenced on June 12, 1944. The government was represented by Carl Sackett, the United States Attorney for the District of Wyoming. The FPC hired Samuel Menon, a prominent civil rights lawyer from Denver, to represent all 62 defendants. One of Menon's first decisions was to waive the defendant's right to a jury, a sensible tactic given the jury pool in Cheyenne, Wyoming. This meant, however, that the fate of all 63 men was entirely in the hands of Judge T. Blake Kennedy, who had been the sole federal judge in the District of Wyoming for over 20 years. Judge Kennedy's views of the defendants were apparent from day one when he addressed the 63 defendants in open court as,
"You Jap boys."
The government's strategy was straightforward. It only had to prove that the defendants received notices but failed to report for a pre-induction physical exam, facts that were not contested. In contrast, Menon sought to paint a broader picture of injustice and unfairness by eliciting testimony as to the defendants' loyalty to the United States, their loss of freedom, and their willingness to serve in the Army once their rights had been restored.
the government called to the stand the clerk of the local draft board, who identified the paperwork proving that the defendants refused to report for their physicals, and they also called the FBI agents who had interviewed the defendants. Through these agents, the government established that the defendants refused to report their pre-induction physical examination notice. When asked to explain their reasoning, one defendant, Yoshito Koromiya, stated,
"If I do not protest, I would be just as responsible as those who made the decision to deprive me of my rights. A citizen who will accept bad government without protest is not a good citizen."
When the defendant's attorney, Samuel Menon, questioned the FBI agents, they admitted that the defendants were all courteous and polite to the agents. The agents further admitted that at no time did any of the defendants say anything against the United States or indicate a disloyal attitude. The government also called to the stand Douglas Todd, the assistant project director at Heart Mountain, who, on cross-examination, resisted the notion that the resistors' rights were curtailed at Heart Mountain.
Is the Hard Mountain Project patrolled by military police?
No, I wouldn't say that it was.
Is it guarded by military police?
There are military police there, yes.
And they are there for the purpose of guarding the project, are they not?
Their function has to do with the Army, and I'm not able to say.
Now, have any of the persons who are confined at Hard Mountain been sent there for violations of the law?
I don't know.
Do you know why they were sent there?
No, I do not.
But do you know that those who are there are restrained of their liberties within the confines of the area?
I don't think they are restrained of their liberties. They are not restrained in any sense.
What would happen to an evacuee if he would attempt to leave the center without obtaining a permit?
That relocation center is a military reservation. The government is feeding the people and housing them, and they would naturally be expected to comply with such rules and regulations as were set up.
The defendants did not call any witnesses and rested at the close of the government's case. In his summation, Menon argued,
Placing American citizens in relocation centers was something Hitler would do.
Sackett responded with outrage and in a very personal manner.
The defense counsel has compared the system of relocation to something Hitler would do. I resent that. These men and their families have been housed, clothed, fed, and schooled by the federal government, perhaps better than the court when he was a young man, and I know better than I was. When the Jews were kicked out of Germany, they were left to fend for themselves, but our government cared for these men and their relatives. The defendants are using my money, your money, everybody's money by having this trial and saying they won't fight for this country. They want freedom, they say. They want freedom so they can go out and signal the Japanese submarines. They all admitted they were loyal American citizens. Is that a cloak back of which to hide or an excuse to get away from the draft?
On Monday, June 26, 1944, after 6 days of trial, Judge Kennedy announced his decision.
The defendants assert that as American citizens by birth, they have been discriminated against by the government. Defendants assert that they should not be reclassified for service in the war, at least until such time as their status of citizenship has been clarified. The discrimination exercised by the government on account of defendants' Japanese ancestry was legitimate, justified, and legal, and within the power of Congress and the President in the war emergency. Defendants' assertion that they did not desire to report until their citizenship had been clarified is without merit as to legal basis. The finding and verdict of the court is that each of the defendants is guilty as charged in the indictment. It is the sentence and judgment of the court that you and each of you shall be committed to the custody of the Attorney General for confinement in such institution as he may select for a period of 3 years. The defendants are all committed to the custody of the United States Marshal.
The government prosecuted the 7 leaders of the Hart Mountain Fair Play Committee, as well as Jimmy Amora, for conspiring to counsel, aid, and abet draft resistors. Judge Eugene Rice, visiting from the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Oklahoma, presided over the trial. A.L. Weirin, a civil rights attorney from Los Angeles, represented the FPC leaders. Sidney Jacobs, a Denver attorney, represented Amora. The U.S. Attorney for the District of Wyoming, Carl Sackett, and Assistant U.S. Attorney John Pickett appeared for the government.
Mr. Weirin, you may put on your evidence.
The defense calls defendant Frank Seishi Emi to the stand.
Frank Emi was one of the leaders of the FPC. He had been a successful grocer in Los Angeles until he was detained and relocated to Hart Mountain. At Hart Mountain, he drove a truck and made tofu for other detainees.
What is your name?
Frank Emi.
You are now in the Wyoming County Jail?
Yes, sir.
Where were you before you came to the county jail?
At Hart Mountain.
For how long?
Since September of 1942.
Sometime this year, did you attempt to walk out of the relocation center?
Yes, on March 29, 1944.
And what happened?
When the draft was instituted and I learned I was eligible for it, I figured I was now recognized as an American citizen. So I walked out of the center with Horino and Tamesa. An armed military police officer stopped me and said he would arrest me if I walked out without a pass. I asked him, if I was an American citizen, didn't I have the right to the freedom of movement? He said no. He said he had orders to arrest me. I said, suppose I resisted. And he said he would have to use force, which I thought implied using a gun. After I was arrested, I was put in the MP guardhouse, and the guard again told me if I tried to get away, I would be shot.
Mr. Emmy, Heart Mountain is a rather large establishment, isn't it?
Yes,
And there's nothing around it but an ordinary barbed wire fence, right?
there is a barbed wire fence and guard towers.
You can get outside though through the gates all around?
No,
Isn't there a rather large portion of land that is farmed outside of the fences?
I think so.
Can people in Heart Mountain go out there to work and raise their crops?
Only with special passes.
Anybody who wanted to work had a pass, right?
No,
Were you ever refused a permit to get out there and go to work?
yes.
The defense called Minoru Tamesa, an oyster farmer and mill worker from the Seattle area, who was one of the leaders of the FPC.
Mr. Tamesa, have you ever complied with orders from your local draft board?
Yes.
When?
Before Pearl Harbor, I was born and raised in a typical American community on the outskirts of Seattle, Washington. I received a draft notice to report for a physical examination, and I did. To protect the security and happiness and freedom of my life there, I was willing to serve my country.
Have you ever not complied with draft orders?
Yes.
When?
After Pearl Harbor, we were evacuated from Seattle to a concentration camp. I received the order from Heart Mountain. It seemed to me that the selective service didn't mean for me to fight to protect the security and freedom of a barracks room in a concentration camp, or to go to war while my family was still imprisoned in the camp. So I didn't report.
Mr. Tamesa, are you a member and leader of the Fair Play Committee, the FPC?
Yes.
What is the mission of the FPC?
To air grievances, improve the situation of those incarcerated, and test the constitutionality of the evacuation.
What do you mean by that, to test the constitutionality of the evacuation?
We wanted to create a test case for the courts. We wanted the government to clarify our citizenship rights before we joined the military. We thought it was unconstitutional for the government to imprison us and strip us of our rights while simultaneously drafting us to serve and fight for this country. We were willing to serve as soon as our rights were restored.
Mr. Tamesa, does this document look familiar to you?
Yes, it's one of the FPC's publications.
Could you read the highlighted text?
It says, "We, members of the Fair Play Committee, hereby refuse to go to the physical examination or to the induction if or when we are called in order to contest the issue. We hope that all persons whose ideals and interests are with us do all they can to help us."
So, Mr. Tamesa, did you and the leadership of the FPC encourage others at Heart Mountain to obey the draft?
Yes, but
Nothing further.
On November 1st, 1944, Judge Rice submitted the case to the jury. After a short deliberation, the jury returned a verdict convicting all 7 leaders of the FPC of conspiracy. Jimmy Omura, the newspaper columnist, was acquitted. The next day, Judge Rice sentenced the 4 defendants he saw as most culpable to 4 years imprisonment. He sentenced the others, whom he concluded played lesser roles, to 2 years imprisonment. All 7 were sent to the maximum security federal prison at Leavenworth, Kansas.
The draft resistance movement at Heart Mountain has been described by scholars as the most articulate reaction recorded to the issues facing the detainees at the 10 concentration camps. Other cases were brought with results that varied little from the Heart Mountain experience. Chase A. Clark, the governor of Idaho, who had demanded concentration camps for any Japanese coming to Idaho, was the federal judge who tried the resistors from the Minidoka Relocation Center. When one of the resistors moved to quash the indictment on the grounds that incarceration rendered unconstitutional the government's attempt to draft him, the court denied the motion without recorded opinion and proceeded to conduct 33 separate jury trials over the next 11 days. The jury for each was selected from a pool of 34 Idaho citizens, so that some jurors sat on as many as 11 cases. One lawyer protested, but Judge Clark overruled his concerns. At sentencing, those who had entered guilty pleas received 18 months in prison, and while those who went to trial received 3 years and 3 months and a $200 fine.
Some resistors in other camps did fare better in the courts. Approximately 100 resistors from the Poston Relocation Center in Arizona were tried and found guilty, but the judge did not send them to jail and fined each defendant 1 penny. And remarkably, one federal judge simply dismissed the charges against the resistors before him on due process grounds, at some personal risk. The Honorable Luis E. Goodman of the Northern District of California was relatively new to the bench when he traveled from his chambers in San Francisco in July of 1944 to Eureka to hear the case of the resistors from Tule Lake. Eureka had been well known for its anti-Asian sentiment since 1885, when all Chinese were expelled from the county, and banned forever. Not surprisingly, when Judge Goodman appointed 2 local attorneys, their defense consisted of entering guilty pleas for their clients. After questioning the defendants himself, Judge Goodman decided to call on another attorney, a friend from San Francisco, to represent them. The new attorney moved to withdraw the guilty pleas and then to quash the indictment. Laboring on a Friday evening in a town without a law library, Judge Goodman and his law clerk put together an opinion and packed their bags for a quick getaway, fearing a lynching. With their car idling outside the courtroom, Judge Goodman read his opinion from the bench on Saturday, July 22nd, 1944.
It does not follow that because the war power may allow the detention of defendant at Tule Lake, the guarantees of the Bill of Rights and constitutional provisions are abrogated by the existence of war. It is shocking to the conscience that an American citizen be confined on the ground of disloyalty, and then, while under the duress and restraint, he be compelled to serve in the armed forces, or be prosecuted for not yielding to such compulsion. The issue raised by this motion is without precedent. It must be resolved in the light of the traditional and historic Anglo-American approach to the time-honored doctrine of due process. It must not give way to overzealousness in an attempt to reach, via the criminal process, those whom we may regard as undesirable citizens. The motion to quash the indictment is granted, and the proceeding is dismissed with respect to the defendants Kuwabara and the 25 other defendants similarly charged.
The government chose not to appeal Judge Goodman's decision, and it was therefore never reversed. In affirming the conviction of the Poston resistors, however, the Ninth Circuit noted that wherein the reasoning of the Kuwabara opinion differs with that of this opinion, it may be taken that we are not in accord therewith.
Meanwhile, the Hard Mountain resistors appealed to the 10th Circuit in Denver. They gathered funds to hire men to argue the case. Fuji was named the resistor, but by stipulation, all 63 of the convicted resistors agreed that their convictions would be controlled by the outcome of Fuji's appeal. Menon argued to the 10th Circuit.
Can the government do no wrong? Can it subject its people to the loss of rights and property without due process, and at the same time require compliance with the Draft Act? What then would the Nisei be drafted to fight for? So their parents, sisters, and brothers can continue to remain behind barbed wire under armed guard? If our government cannot trust American citizens of Japanese ancestry so that we can accept them on an equal basis and accord them equal rights, then how can we ask them to fight? And for what do we ask them to fight for? Is it to fight for a continuation of relocation centers with armed guards and barbed wire? How can we ask them to lay down their lives in approval of such unconstitutional treatment?
In an opinion written by Judge Walter Huxman, the 10th Circuit rejected Menon's arguments and affirmed the resistors' convictions.
Fuji's entire appeal is predicated on the argument that his confinement behind barbed wire in the relocation center without being charged with any crime
deprived him of his liberty and property without due process of law, and therefore he should not be required to render military service until his rights were restored. Fuji was a citizen of the United States. He owed the same military service to his country that any other citizen did. Neither the fact that he was of Japanese ancestry, nor the fact that his constitutional rights may have been invaded by sending him to a relocation center cancel this debt. The judgment convicting the 63 Heart Mountain draft resistors is affirmed.
The defendants who had been convicted in the conspiracy trial also appealed. By the time Weirin argued the appeal to the 10th Circuit, the importance of the instruction he had requested at the trial was clear. As he had hoped, the Supreme Court had reversed the Second Circuit and upheld the test case defense in the Keegan case. On December 26, 1945, the 10th Circuit reversed the judgments of conviction and remanded the cases to the district court.
On April 29, 1945, the 442nd Regiment, the all-Japanese American Regiment, freed prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp. Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. Japan on August 15, 1945. The Heart Mountain Camp closed on November 10, 1945. The Heart Mountain draft resistors continued to serve their sentences until approximately a year after the war ended, and many months after the closure of Heart Mountain. One resistor never saw his freedom. 2 days before he was scheduled to be released, Fred Iriye, who worked as an electrician in the prison power plant, was training the inmate who was to replace him. He touched an electrical switch, believing it had been disconnected. He was killed instantly.
On Christmas Eve, 1947, President Truman granted the draft resistors a full presidential pardon, restoring all civil and political rights. In 1976, President Gerald Ford formally rescinded Executive Order 9066, and in 1988, the United States Congress enacted a Civil Liberties Act. On behalf of the nation, Congress thereby apologized for what it described as fundamental violations of basic civil liberties and constitutional rights of the individuals of Japanese ancestry who were evacuated, relocated, and incarcerated. The bill provided for reparations to incarceration survivors.
What became of the defendants in the Heart Mountain trials? Jimmy Omura may have escaped conviction, but his career as a newspaperman was over. He became a landscape gardener. Upon release from Leavenworth, Frank Emmy, who worked for the Postal Service and later the California State Employment Office. He also taught judo as an 8th degree black belt, and in the 1980s, he joined the Japanese American redress movement and publicly spoke out about his wartime civil disobedience. Emmy passed away on December 1st, 2010, at the age of 94. All told, some 315 Japanese American men defied the draft in World War II. They were by far the minority, as the great majority answered their induction orders, reporting to fight for freedom overseas, even as they and their families were held in concentration camps. In some respects, those who said no were just as courageous as those who fought. They took a stand even as critics labeled them cowardly draft dodgers, and there were whispers that they just didn't want to get shot at. After the resistors were arrested, their families were ostracized by other camp residents. When the war ended, those who fought were welcomed home as leaders, or as heroes, while the resistors remained in prison until they completed their sentences and were then released as convicted felons. Later, when some of the resistors were drafted again to fight in the Korean War, they served willingly, for their rights had finally been clarified when President Truman granted them a pardon.
Most of the draft resistors were not willing to tell their stories for decades. For Japanese Americans and for Americans generally, it was the heroism of the fighting 442nd that inspired, not the principles of the draft resistors. Only recently did the resistors begin to tell their story, and only recently Have even the heroes of the 442nd acknowledge your contribution. Senator Daniel Inoue, a member of the 442nd, remarked as follows.
In this climate of hate, many felt the necessity of stepping forward to volunteer for service in the military to prove their loyalty to the United States. These men, for the most part, carried out their military obligations with much courage and valor. However, in this climate of hate, I believe that it took just as much courage and valor and patriotism to stand up to our government and say, you are wrong. I'm glad that there were some who had the courage to express some of the feelings that we who volunteered harbor deep in our souls.
What can we take away from the story of the Heart Mountain Draft resistors? It is a difficult tale to tell, for it surely suggests that the system doesn't always work as it should. Perhaps the only true lesson is the need for vigilance. One of the children incarcerated at the Gila Relocation Center was Michiura Weglin, who graduated from the Camp High School in 1944 and was freed when Mount Holyoke College gave her a full scholarship. She wrote one of the earlier books about America's concentration camps, and she stated as follows.
I have taken upon myself the task of piecing together what might be called the forgotten or ignored parts of the tapestry of those years. This I have done not to awaken disquieting memories or arouse negative feelings, but because of a clear sense of responsibility. I feel for those whose honor was so wrongly impugned, many of whom died without vindication. More significantly, I hope this uniquely American story will serve as a reminder to all those who cherish their liberties of the very fragility of their rights against the exploding passions of their more numerous fellow citizens. And as a warning that they who say it can never happen again are probably wrong.
Thank you so much. If we can actually have all of our actors and leaders come to the front so we can give them another round of applause. That was very powerful. Thank you so much. So we do have a little bit of time, so I think if we want to open it up for about one or two questions in here, we can do that. But otherwise, I would like to invite everybody out into the lobby for further discussion, because I think we can talk for many hours just on this topic. And this is such an important history to know, and unfortunately, it is being repeated currently.
I did want to make an addendum, really. Yesterday, our president spoke to the Department of Justice and invoked the Alien Enemies Act from 200 some years ago, which was used as the excuse to lock up Japanese Americans during World War II. And he invoked that again to go after basically people who criticize the United States. And so this is definitely something that is very, very relevant today. And also yesterday, former Senator Alan Simpson of Wyoming passed away. And he, along with Congressman Norman Mineta from San Jose, were the ones that sponsored the bill that became the Civil Liberties Act of 1988 that provided reparations and an apology And Senator Simpson and Normanetta met when they were both Boy Scouts, because Simpson was from Wyoming and Normanetta was at Heart Mountain. And they met during incarceration, and they became lifelong friends. And I think that's a testimony to the bridges that we can build. And so we do not want to forget that this happened, and we do want to know that it's happened, could happen again, so.
Yes, thank you. Very, very important. And thank you all for coming here and being a part of this reenactment. Actually, I'm going to just invite all of us into the lobby for further discussion. But before that, just one more time, if you feel comfortable, if you or a family member or someone you knew was incarcerated during World War II, if you could stand up and be recognized as well. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing your stories. One more applause for our amazing actors here, many of which their families were also incarcerated. Thank you for all that you do, not only today, but in your day-to-day lives. You guys are absolutely amazing. And yes, let's all convene in the lobby for further discussion. Thank you so much. And on your way out, we actually have amazing resource pages. If you would like to learn more about this topic and everything that's happening now, we have Program Manager Lorena Loriaga and our volunteer Elijah here with those papers. So please feel free to grab one on your way